I'm going to start admitting folks from the waiting room. Good evening, everybody. If you are just joining us, I'd ask if you could put yourself on mute for the time being. We're just going to wait and ensure we've got a few minutes to give folks some time to log in. We'll get started at about 6:03.
And in the meantime, while you're waiting for us to get started, we have a question here that you can start to answer in the chat. What housing programs or initiatives do you hope will be considered as part of this plan? And we're going to have our translators translate for you as well right now. Allah.
مساء الخير. يمكنك الآن الإجابة عن هذا السؤال في حالة انتظارك. ما هي خطة الإنتاج الإسكاني المحددة لك؟ يمكن الإجابة عن هذا السؤال وطرحها في خانة الإجابات.
Hola, bienvenidos a todos al Foro Comunitario de Vivienda del Plan de Producción en Revere. Mi nombre es Lorena Escolero y si necesitan asistencia con interpretación, me hacen saber o pueden seleccionar el símbolo del globo para seleccionar la interpretación.
And Jen, we're right at 6:03, so I think we can get started.
All right, sounds terrific. And you can always answer the question at any time in the chat if you didn't get a chance to right at the top of the meeting. All right, well, thank you everyone for being here. We do want to just start with some logistics. I'm Jen Goldson, planning consultant, and we do have two interpreters here. And you can use the interpretation function of Zoom, which we have a photo of here, a little screenshot here with the globe there. And you can choose Spanish if you'd like Spanish interpretation. And you can choose, I believe, did we set it to French?
Yes.
So unfortunately, Zoom, for some reason, doesn't let us set Arabic as a language. So we've chosen to set it as French. But if you chime into the French channel, it will give you Arabic by Asma, and Lorena will be translating into Spanish. And I'm planning consultant Jen Goldson. We have Noah Harper here as well. Noah, why don't you just say a quick hi?
Hey, Noah Harper, planning consultant. I've been really delighted to work with the community over the last 6 months. Pass it back to you, Jen.
Great. Terrific. And then we'll pass it on to you, Tom.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I'm Tom Skrowski. I'm the Chief of Planning and Community Development for the city of Revere. Thank you for taking some time out of your busy lives, and especially on a beautiful day like today, to be here with us to talk about housing. If you're here tonight, you've probably heard me in the first public forum or at various city council meetings talking about this issue and being on my housing soapbox generally. So I'll be really brief and tell you something that you already know, which is that housing in Revere is very expensive. And we're in the midst of an affordability crisis. It's expensive to purchase a home for young people. It's expensive for seniors on a fixed income that are trying to keep their place they've been renting for years. It's expensive for families that are juggling the rising costs of childcare and other expenses. And, this is all part of what is really a regional and a national trend as housing costs continue to rise. And because of that, I think at times it can feel really difficult to manage this problem here in Revere, and it can feel overwhelming. And that's why I'm so excited to be here tonight as we reach, at least we're getting closer to the finish line in developing a housing production plan here in the city. And what we're going to be talking about tonight with our team at Jan Goldson is putting together some strategies, goals, and action items to help us confront this crisis head on. So hopefully we can feel less helpless and more hopeful about the situation and really do something about it and take action. So I encourage you all tonight to listen to what we have to say, but please offer your input and advice. We really want to hear from you. We heard some great things in our first public forum. We heard from 261 of you who completed our survey, which was amazing. And, we'd love to hear more input throughout the process tonight as we build this housing production plan that can create those goals and strategies we can work on together. So thank you so much for coming out tonight. And thank you to our project team. Lorena Escalera, our community development planner, has been doing a lot of the work behind the scenes, making sure folks in the community are aware of this work, is interpreting this event in Spanish as we speak, and just generally has been a huge supporter of this work. And similarly, I want to thank our Housing Production Plan Working Group, Layla, Michael, Rafael, Joe, Claire, Claudia, Laura, and Councillor Jaramillo, all of whom have dedicated countless hours building this plan together with us as a team. So thank you all for coming out tonight, and I'll hand it to the Goldson team to take things from here.
Sounds great. Thanks so much, Tom. All right. So we're going to start out with a little bit of interaction first. We're going to do some polling in just about 2 slides. Then I'll cover just a bit of background. I'm not sure how many folks have, how much you already know about what we're doing. So I want to make sure everyone's on the kind of the same page and understand what we've been working on. And then we're going to dive deep into those draft goals and strategies. And at each after we go through the goals, we'll ask you through polling, what do you think of them? You also can access the chat and you can let us know what you think that way as well. And then we'll go through some draft strategy ideas, and we'll again ask you at the end of that, what did you think of these ideas? Do you have any other ideas? And then we'll just talk about next steps. And at the end, we'll have just some time for open Q&A if anyone would like to unmute and speak either a question or a suggestion. That will happen towards the end. So we'll have the Zoom polling. We'll also have, again, that chat to share your thoughts. And then at the end, we'll have that open comment time. All right, Lorena, let's get that polling up. So we have just a few questions. Hopefully you can see that now on your screen. Did you attend the first forum that we had on this project in January? Are you a Revere resident, employed in Revere, business owner, etc.? What is your age? And we have some age brackets there. If you are a Revere resident, do you currently rent your home, own your home, live with family and friends, live in a group home or long-term care, or do not have a home or live in emergency shelter or some other housing situation that I didn't think of? And then how would you describe your racial ethnic identity? And so those are our questions for you. And I think, Tom, you can probably see if people are answering.
Yep, we're about halfway there. So we'll give folks just another.
Perfect. And you might wonder, why are we asking these questions? And part of it is because when you're on Zoom, it's a lot harder to connect with folks. And we like to try to understand who's here, and maybe a little bit about, what kind of perspective you bring to the forum. And all right. So how are we doing, Tom? Are we good?
Yeah, I think I'll end it and we can.
Perfect.
Results.
Let's take a peek at that. All right. So most of you did attend the January forum. So that's really good to know. A few didn't. So I will go over, I'll just touch a little bit on what we covered, but I'm not doing a deep dive. I know that there's a lot of materials out there that you could certainly catch up on. And I believe there is also the recording of the first forum. If I'm misspeaking, somebody tell me that. Looks like most people here are Revere residents, but also some employed in Revere. And then we have, in terms of ages, we do have kind of a younger sector of people, 18 to 34 years, then a little bit in the mid area, 35 to 44, 50%, and some over 55 to 64. And then we have primarily homeowners, 60%, but it's a 60-40 split. So we have about 40% of people who rent their home. And then we have, let's see, 83% identify as white, 17% identify Hispanic, Latino, and Spanish. All right, excellent. So that's really helpful to let us know who's here. So I'll start out. Tom talked about the affordability crisis and how, this plan is really about trying to help Revere confront that crisis in the way that it best can with its resources and through regulatory authority. And so the big question is, why should people care? And so, having housing options, I may be speaking to the choir, I don't know. Having housing options in your community that people can afford and that suit their needs benefits really the whole community. So you provides economic stability, social cohesion, health and well-being, as well as when it's placed in strategic places, can be also environmentally sustainable. And so we've done quite a bit of engagement throughout this process. Tom mentioned the survey. And so I just pulled a little bit just to remind folks, well, what did we hear in the survey? And so some of the top things we heard are, if you're feeling pressures to leave Revere, was the question in the survey. What are the pressures? And top, probably no surprise, mortgage and rent costs. Second is property taxes. And then we had a bunch of write-in comments that basically said, well, we have other concerns. We're concerned about, about 13 people said we're concerned about rising traffic congestion. 11 people said concerns about overdevelopment. And some people said the lack of affordable housing options for seniors wishing to downsize. About 3 people said that. Others talked about concerns about safety, and then finally lack of desired housing options, including multifamily. So that gives you just kind of a sense of, if people are feeling those pressures to leave, where are those pressure points? And then I just pulled a couple of these questions. We had a bunch of other questions in the survey. So what do you think are the most pressing housing challenges? And what we heard is lack of starter homes for people really kind of just starting out, lack of market rate housing options, I think that are within a financially attainable range. And then other challenges, people wrote in comments. People talked about concerns about perceptions of overdevelopment and perceived lack of sufficient community engagement. And then on a related note, some mentioned that new units tend to be rentals rather than ownership units. So those were just some of the general concerns, along with the high cost of housing. All right, so let's zoom out a little bit to the Boston region. We could have zoomed out more because this is a much bigger trend than just the Boston region, but just looking at the whole Boston region, which of course Revere is part of, we've had a lot more household growth than we have housing production. And so you can see, because we've had, and why do we look at household growth rather than population growth? Because population growth tells us only part of the story. The household growth is really what tells us how many units do we need. If people are living in smaller households or if people are living in larger households, it changes the amount of housing units that you need. And so it really changes that demand. So we look at household growth, and you can see that the percentage growth was much higher than the right bar, which is housing unit growth in this time period. And you can start to begin to see, why is there so much pressure on the housing stock and affordability? It's because we just haven't been producing enough in the Boston metropolitan area, as well as the larger Northeast region, and then in many, many metropolitan areas all across the US. And so if you want to zoom in to look at Revere, we can look at some similar data. We look at percentage of household growth in that 10-year range between 2010 and 2020 was about 13% growth in Revere, but only 11% housing production. And so you can see that here again, it's not quite as stark as in the Boston region. You have had more production than many of your other surrounding area communities. However, it still wasn't enough to stem that, that real pressure of the housing costs. So that's what you're feeling there. So I do want to just point out also that your household size has actually increased rather than decreased. So more people are living together than 10 years ago, or in 2020 2010. So your household growth is reflective of that greater household size. If you had smaller households, your growth would have been even more for the same population. So hopefully people are following what I'm saying here. If you're ever confused about something, put it in the chat. Noah is keeping his eyes on that chat, and I'm happy to explain something if I gloss over something or am confusing when I speak. All right. The next thing I wanted to just zoom out again, Boston region again. When we look at prices, we find that where ownership housing is expensive, so is renting, and that in general, all price points, all rental and ownership are just very expensive. In fact, if you look at how many units in the Boston region could a low or moderate income household afford, and it's only about 34% of homes are affordable to buy for low and moderate income families, and about 40% of rentals are affordable to buy. So that lack of production has just put a ton of pressure on housing prices. And in the region, there's a really large gap between the number of owners and rental homes, the number of ownership and rental homes available, compared to the number of folks who need those homes. And what happens then? So we look at incomes. We do in the housing production plan. If you want to read the full thing, you're welcome to, but we do quite a bit of analysis around what can people afford and what does that mean for them. And one of the things we looked at was just what are wages? What are median weekly wages for commonly held occupations in Revere? You can see in the upper left box here, we're just showing the Revere median household income, and that's again in a given week. So it's about $1,400. That's what the median household makes in Revere. So if you took all the households in Revere and you stacked them up and you looked at where is the halfway point, that's what the median is. So there's about the exact same number of households above that point and the same number of households below that point. So you look at other numbers compared to that, and you can see that different professions, commonly held occupations have various levels of weekly income. And then we looked at, well, if looking at weekly income, how much weekly income would you need to afford the median one-bedroom rental apartment in Revere? How much would you need to afford to make your condo payment or a single family housing payment on the median single family home in Revere in relatively current prices? And so you can see that these prices are higher than really most of these professions, and certainly higher than the median household can afford. Now, you might say, well, this is, the household number is everybody in the household. These professions, well, maybe they're married, maybe they have, 2 income earners or 3 income earners in the household, and that's true. And so you need to look at all those factors. But just looking at some baseline numbers, you can see some of the challenges that people are probably feeling, but now you see the numbers as well. And so what happens when people are having incomes that are not keeping pace with how homeowning and renting costs? There's something that we call cost burden. So it just means it could be at any income range. It doesn't have to be just about low income households. But if you're spending more than about a third of your income, about 30% of your income on any housing costs, then you're considered what we consider cost burdened, housing cost burdened. And we looked at Revere, and we looked at, well, how many people in Revere are estimated to be housing cost burdened, spending more than that 30% of their income because those prices are so high and incomes have just not kept pace with those prices. And so you can see that we've broken it out on this chart by income. So extremely low income is the most burdened. As you can see, we have the raw numbers there. And I'm going to explain what these 2 colors mean in a moment. But I just want you to look at the raw numbers of how many households in your community with incomes at or below 30% of the area median income, which I will show you in a minute. I think I have that on the next slide. And then you can look at different income ranges, 30 to 50%, moderate income of 50 to 80%, and then 80% and over. And you can see even folks who are not considered low income are housing cost burdened, although it is declines as people have more income, of course, as makes sense. So if you look at this below 30% AMI, you can see a lot of them are in this orange or yellowy color. 2,950. So I'm just going to call that almost 3,000 people are what we call severely cost burdened and making less than 30% of the area median income. I'm sorry, I keep slipping into saying people. It's actually households. And so why do we care about this? What does this even mean? So when we look at severely cost burden, I told you that cost burden means spending over 30%. But when you look at severely cost burden, and that's what this green moderately cost burden is, the 30%, spending more than 30% of your income. The severely is spending more than half of your income on housing costs. So why do we care about that? We care about all of this because it means people are much, much, much more likely to be housing vulnerable in a unstable housing situation, and really could just take, one expensive bill, one car accident, one medical bill to become unhoused. All right. So I do have that chart. I think I have it a little later. So hold your question on, well, what are those incomes? I know I stuck it in there. I just didn't stick it in quite yet. So in Revere is part of a much bigger picture when we look at housing needs. So it's not all about affordability, although, that's a big part of it. It's also about the types of housing needs that you have, the type of housing types that you need, and the types of households that are forming. And so we see, just as a bigger trend in the country, that multi-generational living is on the rise. And I grew up in a multi-generational household. So you can see me here with my mother, my grandmother, and my great-grandmother. It was, less common when I was growing up, and it's much, much more common now. A big reason is because of the affordability crisis. When you have more adults living together in an extended household, there's more incomes contributing to be able to afford those homes. Household formation rates have surged as well, as millennials are forming households now. So that just means, what does that mean? It just means more people are forming households as millennials are aging into that age. Single person households are on the rise in general, even though Revere has seen an increase in household size. And then there is an aging population. Just in general, these are the bigger trends. And then when we zoom into Revere's reality, and I'm probably telling you things you already know, people are really at risk of displacement for those reasons I said before, because of the levels of housing cost burden, the housing prices, and those pressures. And affordable just doesn't really feel that affordable in Revere to people who live there, because the affordable prices of a lot of, the 80% AMI, you can see that the folks who really need those units, if I go back to the slide, are in that below 50% and below 30% AMI. But even at the 80%, Revere's median income is lower than the regional median income. And so that's another reason why when developers build to that 80% low income threshold, those affordable units don't really feel that affordable to a lot of Revere folks. So those are just some issues that we've seen in some of the engagement and the research that we've done. I want to introduce just a couple of concepts so that when we're talking about these terms, people just all know what we mean by them. You may or may not have heard these terms before. So I like to talk about, a lot of people talk about this, capital A affordable housing and lowercase a affordable housing. And other people use different terms for that concept, dedicated or subsidized affordable housing, and something called naturally occurring affordable housing. So on the one side of the coin, we have official affordable housing. And so let me just go to the next slide real quick, and then I'll go back to that. So what do we mean by that? In Massachusetts, we mean multiple things, but one thing we mean is, can it count on something that the state calls a subsidized housing inventory? And that is some very specific requirements. It has to be at or below, affordable to households that make that 80% of the area median income, which is considered that lower moderate income. Needs to be subsidized in some way, needs to be affirmatively marketed, has an affordability restriction, and can include market rate rents on that subsidized housing inventory, just to throw that in there. I'm happy to talk about these specifics more, but let me just go back to this. So in Massachusetts, when we talk about dedicated affordable housing, it doesn't have to necessarily be on these, some people call it the SHI, the subsidized housing inventory. But if you're being very strict about what do we mean in Massachusetts when we're saying affordable housing, we typically mean this dedicated affordable housing that counts on that SHI. Now, there's something else called naturally occurring affordable housing. It just means units that are market rate, but for various reasons, they may be rented or are selling at levels that are a bit depressed from the general market. It could be that you have a long-term, landlord that just keeps the prices low for various reasons. My husband and I are a landlord in Boston, and we have great tenants. They've been there for 8 years, and we have never raised the rent other than when our taxes incrementally increase. And so I think there are a lot of kind of local landlords like that in communities. So that's one way naturally occurring affordable housing occurs. There are other ways too. Maybe they're in certain areas of the community. Maybe they are owned by other entities, like a mission-based entity. Sometimes churches own properties or other that they aren't technically deed restricted, but they might be selling for below market rate or renting for below market rate. So that's what we mean by naturally occurring affordable housing. And people have this nice name, NOAA, and not to be confused with our Noah here on the call. But when you hear people say that, that's what we mean. And we just mean by that small a affordable, it's financially attainable, but it doesn't happen to have a deed restriction. It's not listed on that official SHI list, and it wasn't subsidized. So that's what we mean by that. And we'll talk about that a little bit more when we get into the strategies and the goals, because it's an important component of Revere's housing stock. All right. So you might wonder, well, in Revere, what is our subsidized housing inventory? So in Massachusetts, the state has a goal that every community contribute its fair share of affordable housing on this SHI, this subsidized housing inventory. And that fair share, according to Chapter 40B, is that each community shall have at least 10% of its total year-round housing stock as affordable. In Revere, you're not quite there. You're at about 7%. So about, let's see. I wanted to just mention a little bit about that, what's counted on that SHI in Revere. So about half of those units on the SHI in Revere, so that's about almost 900 units, 899 units, are perpetually restricted as affordable housing. But there are actually 829 units that are expected to expire in the next 30 years. So between 2024 and 2025. And you might be surprised by that or not. I don't know. But if you are surprised, it's important to know that some units, when they're created, were created based on a certain funding and a certain program that subsidized them, that required a certain amount of affordability in terms of the term. Usually it was 30 years or 50 years, and those come up, and you could lose those 829 units. So that's something to be aware of. And then about 208 of those affordable units are expected to actually expire by 2025. So that's coming up pretty quickly. So that is one concern that we, identified through this process. And let's see, some of these other statistics, almost all of your affordable housing on the SHI are rentals. You have one affordable homeownership unit, and then you need another 718 units to reach that state target. There is one affordable project in the pipeline, and Tom can correct me if this is old information, but we have 110 Ocean Avenue on our list as being in the pipeline for 48 rental units. And I believe that was approved back in the fall. But I don't think that counts in our numbers here. Is that right, Tom?
That's correct. It was approved in the fall, and actually just was announced that the state will be funding that project, although we're still a little ways out from shovels being in the ground, so that's not in those figures. And then this month, there'll actually be a lottery for a series of affordable condo units at 133 Salem Street. And we can put in the chat how you can access those, the lottery, just for folks that are interested. That also will not be included, however, in the subsidized housing inventory, because it's only affordable for 15 years, not 30 as required. But still affordable homes for people to buy, and we'll make sure you're aware of how to access that lottery.
That's great information. Thanks for posting that in the chat too. All right, perfect. So the other thing we looked at when we did our needs assessment was what kind of constraints are there to meeting those housing needs? And we looked at a bunch of things: environmental constraints, infrastructure constraints, as well as development constraints regarding zoning and regulatory constraints. And so one of those pieces I just wanted to point out, because it's relevant to some of the strategies, is that your zoning is actually a constraint in many ways, in that it's really not reflective of the neighborhoods as they were built. And this happens all the time in so many communities we work in, where the community was pretty much built before zoning was put in place, and then the zoning just didn't reflect what was on the ground. And so why do we care about that? We care about that because it does limit private improvement and investment on those properties. And it also limits appropriate infill and redevelopment opportunities, things that would be appropriate given the existing configuration of the neighborhood and the way the neighborhoods feel. You really can't replicate that right now in many communities. And so you can look at this map and you can see all the red on the map. That's basically all the lots that are developed in Revere that actually don't meet what the zoning says they should. And it's not a bad thing for those particular properties. They didn't do anything wrong. It's just that they probably pre-existed before the zoning was in place. And so that's why that's a pretty big barrier to looking at some appropriate infill and redevelopment opportunities. So now let me get into a little bit of what is this? We call it an HPP, a housing production plan. It has a very specific name because it allows the state to give Revere some more authority once it's approved. So it becomes a state-approved plan. We follow the state guidelines very carefully when we put this together so that we know it will be approved by the state when we submit it. And really, at the end of the day, it helps Revere's local decision makers with policies, with zoning, with initiatives, programs, et cetera. And the plan typically deals with zoning programs and local initiative strategies. So what can the city do through regulatory power? What can the city do through its capacity to create programs or fund programs by others? And what can it do in its capacity to do something we call local initiatives, meaning, help to create that housing, maybe by use of surplus land. There's other ideas as well, but that's just to give you an example. And then when you have this kind of a plan, this housing production plan or this HPP, it provides, once it's approved by the state, and once you show some production, it actually can give the Zoning Board of Appeals more authority to deny what we call unfriendly comprehensive permits. But I think the main reason that Revere is probably taking this on is less about that authority and more about trying to come up with a really comprehensive and integrated strategy around how to address housing needs and what can the city do in the next 5 years to really start to relieve those pain points and those pressure points. And so just why does Revere need that HPP? So we know from the housing needs assessment and from talking with Revere residents and business owners and city officials, Revere needs homes that residents can afford, are in safe neighborhoods, have convenient access to both services and jobs, as well as transit, provide stability for Revere residents, are in good condition and energy efficient, and are designed for people of all ages and all abilities. All right, so let me get into the draft goals. And so after we show you these 6 draft goals, we're going to ask you, what do you think about these? We're going to give you a polling question saying, do you strongly agree with these 6 draft goals? Do you strongly disagree? Do you feel somewhere in the middle? And then we'll ask you to put in the chat, why did you answer that way? Why do you strongly agree? Why do you not strongly agree? Are there 1 or 2 of these or more that you want to see us change or have the working committee consider altering? Or is there something missing in here that you would really like to see as a goal? And then after I review the 6 goals and we do your polling, then I'll go into the strategies, and there will be 10 strategies that we share. All right, so the first goal is about that preservation. I mentioned in one of my earlier slides that there are several hundred units that are scheduled to expire their affordability. And so one of the goals, and it's the first goal here, is preserve those units. The city can help through negotiation, through leveraging state resources, federal resources, and potentially local resources as well to help restructure those deals so that those units can be preserved for the long term. So that's under preservation. Oh, I skipped over this and I didn't mean to. And under preservation, we also mean to help create improvements to units, affordable housing units, so that they are resilient to potential impacts of climate change and that they are accessible and energy efficient. All right, next one is about stability. So protecting low and moderate income renters, especially and including and especially the very low income and extremely low income residents you have in your community, including Black, Indigenous, and people of color, from displacement and discrimination, to promote that neighborhood stability as community members feel that pressure of rising rents and rising prices. It's more and more common for communities in this situation to have people really being pushed out of their neighborhoods, of their communities. And so this is a really important goal here, and you can see that it's placed second on our list of goals, stability. Then we talk about wealth building. So the third goal is expanding wealth building for low and moderate income residents, BIPOC, and first generation owners, with support for homeownership that builds equity. And so the opportunity that Tom mentioned with that 15-year restriction, that's something that could potentially help homeowners build equity, because it doesn't have that really long-term deed restriction like a lot of the rental units do. All right, naturally occurring affordable housing stock, we went over what that means already. So, and this gets at stability as well, but this is really looking at what is that stock of housing and how can we prevent displacement of low, moderate income renters by stabilizing those market rate homes with below market rents, including converting some of those homes into deed restricted affordable homes. And we have a few strategies. We'll show you strategies in a minute, but just so you know, all the strategies are trying to get at how can we address these goals. And then the fifth strategy is about supply, increasing supply, encouraging both new rental and ownership homes and multi-generational housing options. So really all housing types that are deed restricted units, affordable to households at that extremely low and very low income, as well as low income. So you can see I have the below 30% AMI, below 60% AMI, and below 80% AMI, to really help reach your goal of that 10% that the state has set out, but also to help address those really severe housing needs at that extremely low and very low income range. And this is where I have that chart I thought I put in a little earlier. So you may ask, well, what are those incomes? So this is just something, it changes every year. It's based on household size. So you can see across the top, we have different sized households, and the chart keeps going. I just didn't want to overwhelm you too much. But if you look at, and this is put out by the federal government, it's put out by Housing and Urban Development Department at the federal level, and it's put out every year. And so in Revere, this is for the area median, it's for the area, the Boston metropolitan area. So it's not just prices for Revere, but all communities within that Boston metro area follow these same prices. So if you have a single person living alone in a household by themselves, maybe they're living in an apartment or a condo, and they make $57,100 or less annually as an income, then they would be considered that very low income range. If they make $34,300 or less, they'd be considered that extremely low income range. And if they make $91,200 or less, they are considered in the low income. And then you go up from there. So if you have 4 people living together, could be in any arrangement. It could be 3 adults and a kid. It could be 2 adults and a kid. It could be 1 adult and a kid. Doesn't matter the ages or who's working, who's not working. If you have 4 people living together in a household, you can see the numbers here. So 130,250 is now the low income at that 80% threshold. And then it goes down to 81,600 for very low, and 40,950 for extremely low. And you can get this by going to huduser.org if you ever want to look it up. It's under the income limits tab. And again, that does change every year. So it's a little bit of a moving target. All right. So now the other part is we're still on goal 5, because there were really 2 parts of goal 5. The first part was those deed restricted affordable units at these various income ranges. The second part is more about that middle income affordable to households with middle incomes of up to that 120% AMI. And I just did a little calculation for you just so you can see, well, what is that calculation? What is 120% AMI right now? And again, this changes every year, but right now for one person, that's about 125,000 or less. And for a 4-person household, it's about 180,000. So trying to hit homes that are affordable to that middle income range as well. All right. And then we have the 6th and final goal, and then I'm going to ask you what you think of these, is encourage new both market rate and affordable homes in places that have good access to public transit, shops, services, schools, parks, public infrastructure, stormwater infrastructure, etc. And so this is all about where and looking at location. So those are the 6 goals. And what I'd love to do now is just hear what you think about it. So let's put that poll up. You can answer, do you feel positively, negatively, or somewhere in the middle? And then once we get those results, and as you're doing that, you can feel also welcome to start putting in the chat, why do you feel that way? And if you answered positively, just tell me, what is it you liked about the goals? If you answered negatively, tell me what you want to see changed to make you like them better. And then again, if you're in the middle categories, somewhat negative or positive, just tell me why, because it's a little hard to know just from the poll. All right, great. So I see some people answering, but this might have been earlier. Noah, you can tell me when they start answering for this this question, okay? I don't know if John was answering this question or a prior one. I think maybe it's this question. It looks like he just posted.
Yeah. I was trying to, as you went through the 6, I was trying to just take notes before I fight.
You're fast. I like that, John. Very prepared.
I'm a pillar of the community.
Wonderful. Thank you. Very good. That's really helpful when we see that. Yes. All right, good. So it looks like we have about mostly positive, but about 50% say positive and 50% are saying somewhat positive. So for everyone else who voted on this, just let me know why you thought it was very positive or somewhat positive. And if there's one thing you'd like to change or more than one thing, please let me know. I see that Joe, agrees with the restructuring of those deals where the units are going to run out. Energy efficiency may help with operating costs. Yep, exactly right. No, absolutely. Stability needs are not just limited to BIPOC, and we should clarify that we mean all people. Especially many households in Revere are mixed. Wealth building is important. However, the only way to meet the required is not through ownership, right? It's tricky. The ownership avenue is very expensive, and it's also very difficult to meet that SHI requirement with only ownership for various reasons, including the expense and including the way 40B is structured, where if you have a rental project and at least 20 or 25%, depending on the income restrictions, are dedicated as affordable housing, the other 75 or 80% can be market rate, luxury homes, rental, and they also count on your SHI towards your number. So by using the rental weighing on the side of the rental, it can make those SHI numbers go up quicker. 4, I'm all for generational housing. Yeah. The code for converting single family homes to multifamily. However, we have not been kind to those scenarios when people sell their homes and had to rip in-laws, and second, they had to rip them out when they sold them. Maybe an amnesty program. Okay, interesting idea, Joe. Thank you so much. Or John, I'm sorry, John. Is there anyone else who wants to share their thoughts about why they like the goals or anything they want to see change? If you have any thoughts about some of the suggestions Joe, I don't know why I keep calling you Joe. John has, that would be great too. All right. Well, as you're thinking about that, I'm going to go on to the next section. And this is where we start to talk about the strategies. And again, we're going to use the same format. This time I'm going to go through 10 strategies. Some of them are kind of groups of strategies, but we're going to go through 10 general ideas. And then we're going to ask you the same question. How much do you agree or disagree? And then we want to put in the chat. So if you have things you want to put in the chat as we're going, that's perfectly fine. And then when I go through the 10, we can look back and look at those. All right. So I like to just, talk a little bit about our method for creating strategies. So sometimes people think only about, we got to produce. And sometimes people are thinking, only about, well, we've got to stabilize. And others are like, we need to just provide subsidies for, rent subsidies or what have you. And what we believe as housing practitioners is that it's actually important to do all of those things. Attacking the crisis from multiple angles is what we recommend. And that's how we've structured the strategies. I'm going to share in the chat with you a link to, it's to a resource. It's a resource called The Affordable City. It's actually a YouTube interview with the author, but there's also a book. If anybody's interested, I kind of nerd out about this stuff, so I love reading about this stuff. But if you're interested, this is a great book. But it basically explains this concept. He calls it, Shane Phillips is the author. He calls it the 3 Cs. The 3 S's rather, and I added a C. So I like to talk about stability, supply, which is production, subsidy, which is where does the money come from? I'm sorry, it's not where the money comes. Subsidy is what kind of programs are you subsidizing? And then capacity is where does the money come from? Where does the capacity, the staff capacity, the resources come from? And so we've organized the strategy ideas within these 4 categories, and you can see that these also relate in some ways to the goals that we just talked about. All right, so here are the 10 strategy ideas, and the question is, what do you think of them? So stability. So we look at naturally occurring affordable housing, and what are the ways we can preserve those homes? What are ways that maybe we can convert some of them to actual deed restricted affordable housing? And so there's one a method called the right of first refusal. It would be basically a payment to volunteer property owners who own these. They're typically multifamily buildings who want to have the cash in return for something called, it's a legal term called the right of first refusal, which just means the city or perhaps some other entity gets the first ability to bid on your home if you're going to sell it. So when you want to sell that multifamily, you first ask the entity who holds the right of first refusal to put in a bid for that. And they get first dibs, basically. And typically you can negotiate that, but it typically comes with some kind of a payment just to kind of be first in line. And then another idea is just really partner. And these are not mutually exclusive, by the way. They really can work together. So another idea is just really partnering. You have nonprofit and mission-driven developers in your community, in the region, to really work on purchasing and rehabbing those buildings, those units. And that can be a way of converting those units to permanently affordable, deed-restricted affordable units. And then another idea that goes hand in hand with some of these ideas are creating something called a community land trust and really supporting that with city funds, with housing trust funds, which we'll talk about in a minute. And what do I mean by a community land trust? It's not something that a lot of people have heard of before. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to explain what I mean, but I'm also just going to post something in the chat that gives some more resources if people are interested in doing a bit more of a deep dive. I think they have some videos there and other resources, but it's basically a nonprofit organization that could be formed. It's typically focused on affordable housing that is ownership. And so let's say this CLT, some people call it Community Land Trust, is this nonprofit entity. It gets some city funds. It goes out and maybe it tries to buy some of this naturally occurring affordable housing, or it could even buy a vacant developable lot and build affordable housing. Then it creates home ownership opportunities in that way. And the interesting thing about a CLT is that it always retains ownership of the land. And it offers these units or homes, it could be single family, 2-family, could be any housing type. It offers these homes for affordable ownership. And one way it, number one, makes sure that they're always affordable forevermore. And number two, actually affordable prices, is that it always owns the land. So it takes the land cost out of the equation altogether. And these homeowners then have a ground lease with this community land trust. So they own their home, they can sell their home, they can even make some equity on their home when they sell it. And the idea here is that you give that benefit of wealth building and get kind of the best of both worlds, where you're also preserving that affordability, and those units will be protected forevermore. So that's an idea. It's a little bit on the complicated side, but it's something that's certainly been talked about in Revere, and the city can really do things to basically support that kind of a nonprofit to help preserve those naturally occurring affordable housing units. So that's one idea around stability. We kind of bundled ideas that can work together around preserving those NOAA homes. All right, let's look at another supply one. The city has some surplus land. We looked at some various sites, including the Central Ave parking lot, which you can see here. There are other sites that are also something called tax title parcels, which just means they're, folks might be behind in property tax, and it's gone on so long that they become tax foreclosed properties. And sometimes those are properties you can't do much with. Maybe they don't meet the letter of the law in terms of zoning, but as you see, most properties don't meet the letter of the law in terms of zoning and Revere. So the idea is, can the trust perhaps do something with those tax title parcels? And in fact, that's something the trust is already looking at. There are a handful of tax title properties that could be something for probably smaller scale affordable development, maybe provided through a request for proposals to a nonprofit mission-driven developer. Same thing with this idea for Central Ave parking lot. So there's one idea about supply and using surplus land. Another idea is partnering with the housing authority. Are there housing authority properties that could have more units on them? And so I pulled up this one, the Coolidge Street area, just to kind of show you what that looks like. The level of density you can see is a bit different from the build out of the rest of the community. Is there a way to infill that, maybe make it a little bit more similar to the rest of the community, and increase those units? And the city could certainly partner with the housing authority to help leverage resources and make that a possibility. Another idea around supply is about zoning. We bundled a bunch of little ideas about zoning that together could have a really big impact. So you could do things like make zoning actually reflective of what's on the ground. Make it so that you don't have so many of those red non-compliant lots, and that means people can invest in their properties, redevelop, improve their properties, create additions on their properties, convert their properties perhaps to other housing types, and redevelop. Allowing those by right 2 and 3 family homes in all residential districts was another idea to really do that gentle density. Those aren't huge big skyscrapers. There's something that fits in really nicely to the character of the built out neighborhoods already. Another is something I know the city's talked about for several years, is something called inclusionary zoning. When a developer builds multifamily, you can actually require them to have a certain percentage that are restricted as affordable housing. And you can even say, we want these to be affordable, not just to meet the state's 80%, which a lot of people in Revere can't even afford, but we want them affordable for 30% AMI or 50% AMI. And of course, you need to make sure that it's feasible. And there's all sorts of feasibility analyses you can do that our firm specializes in as well. But looking at doing that in a way that can stimulate market opportunities so that developers are creating these deeply affordable units and not taking, funds from the city pocket to do that. Minimizing or eliminating off-street parking requirements, especially near transit, makes the units a little bit easier to build and more feasible. And then allowing that single room occupancy under your zoning that can help create that permanent supportive housing, especially for people who are at that extremely low income, either at risk of being unhoused or have experienced being unhoused. All right. And then I think this is the last one on supply category. This is not necessarily increasing the supply in and of itself, but when you do, let's be smart about how we do that. We did hear people really concerned about traffic impacts of development. Well, many communities, including Everett, Boston, Cambridge, they have something that's called transportation demand management. A lot of people abbreviate that to TDM, and they create a point system for developments. You can do things like, this development will get, more points in terms of the approval process if you show that people who live here will drive less because you're providing all sorts of incentives. You can provide incentives to ride transit, bike more, walk more, carpool, using car share. The developers can provide subsidies, T-passes, provide resources. Maybe they provide, go above and beyond with bike racks, bike sharing, et cetera. So there's all sorts of different ways that developers can actually be incentivized to encourage that alternative types of transportation. All right. And then we have the subsidy category. So under subsidy, we have a couple program ideas. One would be a mortgage down payment assistance program. And maybe you're used to hearing for first-time homebuyers. I'm going to change your thinking a little bit here and have you think about first-generation homebuyers, people whose parents and maybe their grandparents, were not able to afford to buy a home. And this will be the first-generation homebuyer. And so that's something that we're seeing really helps that wealth generation and especially in the racial wealth gap that we see all over the region and really all over the country as well. And then we have another idea, local rent to own program. So, rent a unit and part of your rent fee, your rent cost goes into a little savings so that you can save up for a mortgage and then eventually buy your own place. These programs are relatively common, I would say, and there's lots of good examples for them. All right, subsidy, another subsidy idea. This is the subsidy by not necessarily providing money, but allowing less tax collection. So it's a subsidy in terms of doing tax incentives for the development of affordable housing. And so there's lots of different ways the state enables communities to adopt tax incentives. And I just copied this from a state website. There are 5 property tax exemptions communities can adopt, and they incentivize all different types of housing, including workforce housing and affordable housing. And I'm not going to get into all the details of how these work and how you get approval for them, but there's certainly ways you can do tax incentives to create affordable development that doesn't cost the city money in terms of subsidizing it with the trust fund or other funds like that, but you basically accept less taxes for a time period so that operating cost can get up and running and the development can be feasible up front, and then eventually you start to collect those taxes later. All right, under capacity, this has been talked about quite a lot in this process. Adopting the Community Preservation Act, it can fund not just housing, historic preservation, open space and recreation as well. It's created a lot of benefit across the whole state. And of course, there is state money that goes along with it. It's not just a local money that's collected, but it's also state money that's provided only to communities who have adopted it. So anytime someone in Revere has a property transaction, they're already paying into the state pot. It's called the Community Preservation Trust Fund. And so anytime you sell property in Revere or transfer ownership of property in Revere or do other kind of property transaction, the private entities that are doing these transactions need to pay a fee into this Community Preservation state fund. And right now, Revere people are paying into it, but they're not benefiting from it. So that's really capitalizing on what's already out there. And you can do it at all sorts of levels. And there are all sorts of exemptions for low-income households, for seniors. You can do all sorts of different percentages from 0.5% of your local property tax to 3%. And there's all sorts of analyses you can do to figure out, well, what's the right way to do this? It's not just one size fits all, but I'm not going to get into those details. I'd be happy to talk about them if people are interested, but just wanted to throw this out as a possibility for the community to create more funds for housing along with these other benefits. And then in terms of capacity, so Revere has a municipal affordable housing trust. It's something that the state enables communities to adopt on their own. And Revere took the initiative to do that, I think, a couple of years ago now. And the trust has been successful at getting started. The real issue is that it doesn't have enough money. It doesn't have enough money, and it doesn't have enough of a regular revenue stream to really make a plan feasible for the future. And so the question is, can we create other revenue streams for this trust so that it can actually help address this housing crisis? And what does a trust do? I'm not going to get into all the details, but a trust can basically help the city create housing. It can help offer those surplus properties. It can create programs. It can provide funding for mission-driven developers who are creating housing, maybe preserving those NOAA units. It can help community land trusts. And these are some examples of some kinds of revenue streams Revere might be able to think about. Some of this relates to some of the strategies I talked about before. Community Preservation Act could be one revenue stream. That's often the most important revenue stream for trusts who have the benefit of CPA funds in their community. Inclusionary zoning payments may not be a regular stream, but if you have enough development, you can get some payments into the trust that way. Some communities have done things like cell tower payments on city-owned property, for the leases of Verizon or whatever cell towers might be on city-owned property. You can divert those payments right to the trust. You can even sell that tax foreclosed property. I talked about you can develop the tax foreclosed property potentially, transfer that property into the trust, but you can also sell that and put some of that money into the trust and then negotiated developer payments. I think that is actually one of the ways you already have some money in the trust is you can negotiate some payments from private sector developers. All right. And then another idea for capacity, really kind of the umbrella idea for everything we've talked about, maybe except for zoning, because that doesn't usually cost you money other than maybe some smaller consultant fees, is for these other ideas, really actively pursue, and I think you have been doing this, but really continue to do this, pursuing that state and federal funding sources to support housing production and have the strategic growth in those beneficial locations that we talked about. And I have a whole list of federal programs and some state programs here, but I'm not going to bother going through the whole list, but just know that there is money available out there. Okay, so those were the 10 strategy ideas, a little more than 10, but we bundled them into 10. And so the question is, what do you think? So please take the little poll we have here, the one question poll, and then pop in the chat, what did you think? What did you like? What do you want to add? Okay, great. So we have some things we're adding. So let me just see. I'm trying to go back to where this started. We have quite a few. Okay, I see it. The right of first refusal is a great option. We really should consider community land trust. Great. Thank you, Michael. Does the homeowner get to set the sales price? Oh, John, that's a good question. I actually don't recall, and it might depend on the community land trust and how they set that up. I think there probably is some level of a cap just to make sure that it is still affordable. But that's a very good question. And if somebody else on the call knows the definitive answer, you're welcome to chime in or post it in the chat. Oh, thanks. Tom already answered. Good. Yes, but the organization purchases the right gets to jump.
I think at that time he was speaking of the right of first refusal versus community land
trust. Oh, got it.
I'm speaking first refusal, right? If you may own the right of first refusal, I get the set market rate, or and if you're outbid, do you have to meet that bid, or which I would imagine.
So it's a good question, John. And a city and town is bound to base their acquisition of any property on real appraisal methods, that are justified. So you have to just be careful about that. Sometimes you can justify because the market is saying that this is what it's worth. But if an appraiser, doesn't agree, or if you get a second opinion, it might be a little bit more limited on that. But yeah, so that's typically how it works. I don't know, Tom or others, if you have other experience with that kind of bidding. You can.
I have experience with right of first refusal in another community where it was actually with regard to farmland, but it was a similar concept where basically the city or state jumps to the front of the line, and in this case, we would pay for that right essentially. But I think that it's something worth looking into and something we're looking at exploring. And I know one of John's concerns is, would it be worth it for the property owner at the end of the day? And I think that's what he's getting to. And it certainly wouldn't be sold at a below market rate.
Right.
So property owners could continue to build wealth and equity.
Great. All right. And then we have a heads up. Yep. Thank you, Raphael. Does the city have to approve SROs for them to exist? Yes. And it's prohibited in most districts. Okay, great. So a lot of these are answered, Tom, already. Trying to skim through if there's any. I recommend, let's see, Raphael recommends adding an affordable housing overlay district, okay, to the list of already potential strategies. Thank you, Raphael. Yeah, a lot of communities are doing affordable housing overlay districts to really incentivize. It doesn't take any rights away from the underlying zoning district. You can still do everything you can do, but it adds some incentives for creating affordable housing. More I listen, the worse it got. The missing middle is my concern. Yeah.
And I mean, John, one thing I'd say there is, a lot of the zoning changes that we talked about, maybe not inclusionary zoning, but adding 2 and 3 families by right, reducing lot sizes, that, I live in a 2-family, and that was the only way I was able to buy into the Boston housing market. So I think creating more of those opportunities by improving our zoning ordinance is one step. But another one is also the last one that Jen had mentioned, which is looking at actively pursuing different resources that are available. There's a few different resources, both for homeownership and renter, that are available at the state level to help support missing middle housing. So I think there's a lot of that is baked into the various strategies, and it's certainly something we're very concerned with here at the city.
Yeah, and I'll talk about it. So, as someone who's concerned that, listen, I'm not resource disadvantaged, right? My wife and I both work. We're blessed, but I don't own 150 units in Revere, right? So I think you've got to be either benefiting from building all these apartments and renting them out at whatever rate or rent you can get, or you've got to be in a position where you qualify for all these programs that give you the incentives for down payment support and low down payment and market and preferred rates and all these benefits that people need. Right? And listen, I grew up in a 3-family East Boston Section 8 kid. We had nothing, right? So I'm supportive of it. I want to see it, but I also, as someone who's owned a home in this city for 15 years now, I've also seen every empty patch of land in my neighborhood developed, and even patches of land that weren't developable since the zoning changed 6 months ago. Now, within minutes, there was houses thrown up, right? And they're not owner occupied. So it's things where I think one of the things I proposed was, is there anything to help with the overall cost of home ownership? I'll give you an example. My car insurance is $800 a month. Okay. And I have a teenage driver. That's part of it. Right. But so when you're talking almost 10 grand a year to pay car insurance in Revere, is there anything the city can do to support that? When you look at other cities like Cambridge and some towns where they do citywide Wi-Fi, right? I mean, these are things that we're all paying. I pay $400 a month for Comcast. I pay $400 a month for Verizon. So for a family of 5, it's not just the mortgage price. That is what it is. We live in a very expensive area, but it's all of the additional costs of operating your home that we've got to figure out, right? And I think there was some of the things we talked about, the affordable housing, to get the make sure it was energy efficient. That's great stuff, and there's things there. But I mean, the week of Christmas, I spent 10 grand in a heating furnace and a water tank, right? So it's just for folks that are kind of in the middle, there's no resources available to me to try to stay above water. And I'm in a good situation, but the reality is I don't have I'm on the hook for every penny, and I don't have any benefit I don't have tax deductions as a landlord, and I don't have any access to government programs as someone that's lower income. So the people like me, they're in the middle, which I think is probably half of the city, or third of the city, we'll say, are in the middle. I'd love to see something there to support the folks that are kind of, fighting the good fight and don't fall into either one of those categories at either end of the extremes.
Great point. And from one family of 5 to another, I hear you loud and clear. Trust me.
Well, I know you do.
I'm just glad I don't have to pay for my kids' car insurance yet.
Yeah, we just started doing that ourselves. Can we share the polling results, Tom?
Oh, I thought I did. I'm sorry about that.
Okay, great. Okay, so we did get a negatively. I wonder, John, was that you? Was that your comments on the middle income, or was that
Oh, it was me.
anyone else wants to share?
It was totally me. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right. So now I'm just going to go through, the schedule, and then if anybody else wants to speak, you're welcome to, and then we'll adjourn. So we have, we're preparing this plan this summer. Basically, we wanted to get your feedback first before we went too far with these strategies, so that we can make some modifications and additions as you've suggested to both the strategies and the goals. So Noah and I will be working on that draft over the next couple months. We'll be working with the working group, and then in August, I'm not sure if we have a date yet. Noah or Tom can let me know, but I think we're supposed to present the draft HPP in August. I'm assuming to the planning board. Sometimes it's a combination of planning board, city council, but it's up to you all. And then in September, we can revise it and it'll be ready for local approval. Both the city council and the planning board are required to approve it before we submit it to the state. So that's the general process. And Tom, I don't think we have a date on that, August.
No date set yet.
All right. And so that is the end. And I just would love if anybody else wants to speak. I'm happy to take these slides down so it's a little easier to see each other. Is there anyone else who wants to, either you might have a question or perhaps you just have a comment you want to make?
Thanks for the airtime. Thanks for always letting me kind of pipe in. And I'm on the planning board, so I'll see y'all in August.
Oh, excellent. Thank you, John.
And I see right as we were wrapping up, April put a great comment in the chat about balancing, improving our transportation with ensuring Revere isn't becoming gentrified. And I think you could say both with transportation and transit, you could say the same about a lot of the things, increasing supply. So, on the transportation side, I know we're really excited about some of the work with the MBTA and the Better Bus Network redesign that's actually starting in Revere as phase 1 this December. And I think that can help produce transit impacts that are felt by our most low-income and moderate-income residents, which is great. But hopefully also overall, we're considering kind of the supply and stability facets of our strategies to make sure we're preserving folks that want to stay here and aren't kicked out through the forces of gentrification. That's a great point, April. Thank you.
Is there a deadline for this to be completed?
I mean, we have a kind of our terms of our contract deadline, but there's nothing that the city, I don't think, needs to do in terms of the state. It's a voluntary plan.
Okay, I'd just be concerned that it goes in front of the city council and then there's months of deliberation there. Perhaps if something goes out to them now so that they can at least be aware of what's being requested, or so that this doesn't become just put into a committee and leave there for months at a time.
That is a great point, and that is actually a big reason why there's a gap between now and August, aside from everyone's summer vacations and so forth. But we want to make sure we're taking time to meet with folks in the community, meeting with counselors, and making sure they're well aware of this before it hits their desks in a formal public meeting. So great point,
Yes.
Mike.
Well, the council has a lot on their plate over the next couple of years, so we have to keep that in mind.
Absolutely.
I had a question more about collecting of data / input. I know you all had sent a survey out, and we're kind of a small but hopefully mighty group tonight. Are there other kind of points where additional data is going to be collected in terms of community input on this plan?
Yeah, I mean, we're basically at the point where we're writing it. We try to collect as much information and engagement data as we can before we even write anything, so that when we write it, we're really responding to what people are telling us. And then the next phase is a little bit more traditional engagement, at that public presentation in August to the planning board / city council or both. I'm sure that they will take public comments. That is very, very common. I think that the city could also put the draft up when we provide it to the city council and planning board, put that draft up for public comment on the city website if you want to, really read it. And then we'll work on revisions in September, and then present it, for approval at that point. So there's still a little time to make comments, but yeah, we were hoping to, before we write it, to really make sure, do we have these strategies down right? And are there things that we can, adjust and change before we write it? So that's what we were hoping to do tonight. So thanks, April.
Yeah, great question. And we're also going to put the link from Revere TV. Shout out to Jessica, Revere TV, for getting this live tonight. We'll post the link in our monthly newsletter that'll go out next week. And that'll also provide opportunities for folks to stay engaged to our newsletter, but also if they want to reach out to Lorena or myself, I put my email in the chat. Happy to talk with you all further about this as we work towards completing this plan.
All right. I think that's all we had. I don't know, Tom, if you want to say any closing words before we close it out.
I think I'm all set. Folks have heard enough of me tonight, but I look forward to move into strategies and actions in the months ahead.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.